In the spring of 1900, an assistant engineer named George Nauman stood on the bank of the Susquehanna River, a little north of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and studied the wide gray water where he was about to raise the longest stone bridge the world had ever seen. The plan in his hands called for 3,820 feet of cut stone laid clear across the river. 48 arches, each one a span of 70 feet, one after another after another. A wall of masonry marching from the near shore toward the little town of Marysville on the far side. And the most striking figure in that plan was the time allowed to build it. 2 years. The Pennsylvania Railroad meant to throw the greatest stone arch bridge on earth across a broad river in about 2 years. And it did. It is still there. That is the first thing worth knowing. More than a century after the last stone was set, the Rockville Bridge still stands across the Susquehanna, and heavy trains still cross it every day. It was built for that, and built to do it, in the words of the men who paid for it, almost forever. They called it the bridge built to last forever, and so far the boast has held. This is the story of how it was raised, why a railroad at the height of its power chose stone over iron, and how the new power of steam came together with the oldest craft in the building trades, the craft of the arch, to make something that has outlived the men, the company, and the century that built it. Begin with the river, because the river is the reason for all that follows. The Susquehanna is broad and shallow and ancient, one of the great rivers of the eastern country, and where it passes Harrisburg, it spreads out the better part of a mile from bank to bank. A river like that is a wall to a railroad. You cannot go around it or through it. You must go over it, and the place you cross becomes one of the most important points on the whole line for as long as the railroad lives. The men of the Pennsylvania Railroad had fixed their crossing here, at a bend called Rockville, back in the 1840s. And by the turn of the century, nearly all the east and west traffic of the line funneled across the water at this single point. To understand why so much rested on one crossing, you have to understand the company that owned it. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not merely a railroad among railroads. It called itself the standard railroad of the world, and for once the boast was earned. It was the richest and busiest railroad on earth, a corporation so vast that it moved more freight and more passengers and more money in a year than the treasuries of many nations. Its main line ran from the Atlantic seaboard across the mountains of Pennsylvania toward the great cities of the interior. At the head of that company stood a man named Alexander Cassatt. He had come up through the ranks as an engineer, a builder by training and temperament. He was brother to the painter Mary Cassatt, but he had given his life not to art, but to the iron road. When he took the presidency, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, he began to spend on a scale that startled even his own board of directors. Cassatt believed the only way to hold the lead was to build boldly for a future far larger than the present. His plan was twofold and enormous. First, he set out to widen the main line clear across Pennsylvania to 4 tracks, so that fast passenger trains and slow, heavy freight trains could run at the same time without ever standing in one another's way. And second, in the boldest stroke of his career, he set out to tunnel beneath the Hudson River and carry his railroad directly into the island of Manhattan, into a great new terminal in the heart of New York City. That terminal would become the original Pennsylvania Station, the vast temple of stone and steel and glass that generations of Americans would pass through. Cassatt himself would not live to see it opened, for he died before the great works he had begun were finished. But the vision was his, and every part of it rested on the main line behind it, being able to carry the traffic. A 4-track railroad reaching east from Pittsburgh and Altoona, and the coal fields, was worth nothing if it choked down to a bottleneck at the Susquehanna. And a bottleneck is exactly what Rockville had become. The crossing that carried all of this weight was, by 1900, already the 3rd attempt in a single lifetime to bridge the river at this one spot. Twice before, the men of the railroad had built here, and twice before, the traffic had outgrown what they built almost as soon as it was finished. The first Rockville Bridge had opened on the 1st of September, 1849. It was a wooden truss bridge built to carry a single track, and it did the work of its day honestly. But timber burns and timber rots, and a single track was soon far too little for the tide of traffic gathering behind it. 50 years is a long and honorable life for a wooden railroad bridge, and yet the first Rockville Bridge was outgrown and gone long before those 50 years had run out. The second bridge came in 1877. This one was iron, A double-track truss, a long span of riveted metal that more than doubled what the crossing could carry. But the Pennsylvania Railroad was not like other lines, and the traffic across the Susquehanna did not grow the way ordinary traffic grew. It doubled, and then doubled again. Within 20 years, the iron bridge in its turn had become a bottleneck, straining under trains far heavier than its builders had imagined, and standing squarely across the path of Cassatt's four-track future. The crossing that fed the busiest railroad on Earth could carry only 2 tracks. Something had to give. Here the railroad made a decision that sets this bridge apart from nearly every other great crossing of its age. The obvious choice, the modern and cheap and quick choice, was to build once more in iron and steel. Steel was the material of the hour, and a steel bridge could be flung across the river faster and for far less money than any bridge of stone. But Cassatt's engineers looked past the cost of the first year and thought about the next 100. Iron and steel rust. They grow tired and brittle under the endless pounding of the trains, and in the end, however well made, must be pulled down and built again. The railroad had already replaced this crossing twice. It had no wish to replace it a 4th time, so they chose stone, and it is worth understanding why stone is different, because in that difference lies the whole reason the bridge still stands. A stone arch, built properly, does not hang, or pull, or strain against rivets and tension. It stands in pure compression, every stone pressing down and outward against its neighbors, carrying its load the way the ground itself carries the weight of a hill. The Romans grasped this 2,000 years ago, and Roman arches still stand, still carrying roads and water after 20 centuries. A properly built stone arch asks for almost nothing. It does not rust, and it does not tire. It needs no paint and little repair. It simply holds, decade after decade, under loads far greater than the ones its builders pictured. For the busiest railroad on Earth, a bridge that would never need replacing was worth almost any price. That was the cold logic behind the warm old nickname. They called it the bridge built to last forever, and they meant it not as poetry, but as a hard business calculation. And so the order went out to build the new Rockville Bridge, not in the fashionable steel of the moment, but in the patient stone of the ages, on a scale never before attempted anywhere in the world. The design that came off the drawing boards was severe and magnificent in its plainness. 48 arches, each a clean half-circle spanning 70 feet, set on massive stone piers standing in the river and along its banks, with heavy abutments anchoring each end into the shore. 3,820 feet from end to end, the better part of a mile of solid masonry stretched across the water. And it was built wide. Where the old iron bridge had carried 2 tracks, this one was laid out to carry 4. A deck broad enough for the whole flood of the main line to cross abreast. Fast trains and slow, eastbound and westbound, all at the same time, and none of them waiting. It was never meant to be delicate. It was meant to look and to be permanent, as solid and unhurried as the hills it joined. There is a particular and lasting satisfaction in the work of men who set out to build things that would outlast them. And if that is the kind of history that stays with you, then subscribe to Global Old History. Now to the building of it, the heart of the matter. The railroad did not hand the whole job to a single contractor. It split the bridge in 2 down the middle of the river and set 2 firms building toward each other from opposite banks, at once a race and a partnership. The eastern half went to the firm of Drake and Stratton. The western half, reaching out from the Marysville side, went to the firm of H.S. Kerbaugh. Each would sink its own piers and turn its own arches, working steadily inward across the water, until the 2 halves met near the middle of the Susquehanna and became one continuous bridge. Overseeing all of it, walking the staging day after day, checking the line and the levels and the cut of every stone, was that assistant engineer we began with, George Nauman. Between them, the 2 firms put more than 800 men to work along the banks. They came from many places, as the men who built America's great works so often did, and a great number were Italian immigrants, newly landed and hungry for hard, steady labor. Among those 800 were about 300 skilled stonemasons, and those 300 were the beating heart of the enterprise. A common laborer can carry stone, a steam machine can lift it. But only a trained mason can cut a rough block of hard granite to the exact wedge an arch demands, and set it dead true, and know by his eye and his hand and long years of habit when a course of stone is right and when it is not. The knowledge in the hands of those 300 men was old knowledge, carried across the ocean out of the old country. It was the same knowledge, in its bones, that had raised the cathedrals and aqueducts and bridges of Europe for 1,000 years and more. An arch of stone is one of the oldest ideas in all of building, and it has never been improved upon, only rediscovered by each new age with the sense to use it. The mason who stepped off the boat at a crowded eastern port and rowed inland to the Susquehanna carried in his hands a craft older than any railroad, older than the young nation he had come to. He set his stones the way his people had set them for generations, and his work would stand, like the Roman work before it, long after everyone who knew his name had passed from the earth. Before a stone could be set, the material had to be brought to the river and made ready. Granite and sandstone, the two stones of this bridge, are among the most durable building materials the earth provides, hard and heavy and slow to weather. Great quantities had to be delivered to the work and stockpiled in yards along both banks, block upon block upon block, a mountain of raw stone waiting to be cut and dressed and lifted into place. 220,000 tons of it, in the end. Try to hold that number in your mind for a moment. 220,000 tons of stone, every ton of it handled, and shaped, and moved, and set in the span of about 2 years. Consider next what it takes to build a pier in the middle of a living river, a thing most people never stop to think about. You cannot pile stone upon open water. The men had to wall off sections of the riverbed, pump the water out, and dig down through mud and gravel until they struck rock, or ground firm enough to carry a mountain of masonry for 100 years without settling an inch. Only then could a pier begin to rise, course by course, up out of the riverbed toward the level where the arches would spring. It is patient, dangerous, unglamorous work, done down in the cold and the wet. And every pier of the Rockville Bridge began this way, hidden beneath the water where no rider on any train would ever see it. And the river did not stand politely still and wait. The Susquehanna runs, it rises with the heavy rains, and in the depth of winter, it carries ice down its whole length in grinding sheets. Every pier had to be founded to stand against the push of the current, the violence of the floods, and the slow shoving weight of the winter ice, not for one season, but for every season to follow, on down the long years. The men who built those piers built them for a river they knew would do its worst. And in all the decades since, through every flood and every frozen winter, the Susquehanna has thrown at them. The piers have stood exactly where they were placed. And here is the part of the story that has to be told plainly and honestly, because it is the truest part and the most interesting. This was not a bridge built entirely by hand. It could not have been. No crew of masons, however skilled, could have raised 220,000 tons of stone across the better part of a mile of river in 2 years, by the strength of their arms alone. The Rockville Bridge was built at the dawn of the machine age, and it used the machines of that age without apology. Steam cranes and steam derricks stood along the rising piers, hissing and clanking and belching black smoke, and it was they that did the brute lifting, swinging blocks of stone that weighed tons up out of the yards, and holding them steady where the masons waited to receive them. There was concrete in it too, and a great deal of it. About 150,000 cubic yards of concrete went into this bridge, filling the deep hearts of the piers and the cores behind the arches. It is worth pausing on that number, because it tells you what kind of structure this really was beneath its ancient-looking skin of stone. The old cathedral builders had packed the insides of their thick walls with rubble and mortar for the same reason, to give their work mass and weight. At Rockville, the packing was concrete, poured by the tens of thousands of cubic yards into the hidden body of the bridge where no eye would ever see it, and it gave the whole structure an enormous, brooding heaviness that cut stone alone could never have supplied. But the face of the bridge, the skin of it, the part that meets the weather and carries the thrust of each arch, was the patient work of human hands. Behind the smoke of the derricks and the wet gray of the fresh concrete, the 300 masons cut and set the facing stone in the ancient way, block by block and arch by arch. The granite and sandstone were dressed to fit the exact curve of the span, every wedge-shaped block a little different from the one beside it, each worked with mallet and chisel, until it would seat exactly where it belonged and nowhere else. This is slow and careful and knowing work. It cannot be rushed and cannot be faked, and the men who could do it well were worth more to the railroad than any machine on the site. To turn an arch of stone, you must first build it something to grow upon. So the masons and carpenters raised great curved frames of heavy timber, called the centering, spanning from the top of one pier to the top of the next, cut to the exact shape the finished arch would take. Over that wooden form, the masons laid up their dressed stones, beginning low at the springing on either side and working upward, course by careful course, toward the crown. Until the arch was closed, it could not hold itself up at all. It leaned its whole growing weight on the timber below, and the timber bore it, and the men labored on above, trusting the wood to hold the shape until the stone was ready to take over. Then came the moment every stonemason both lives for and quietly dreads, when the last stone at the top, the keystone at the crown, was driven down into its place. The arch was closed and complete, and only then could it stand alone. The centering was eased and struck away, the timber taken down piece by piece, and for one held breath, the arch stood on its own for the first time, carrying nothing but its own great weight across 70 feet of open air. If the work was true, it held. It settled a fraction of an inch into itself, and locked, and was finished. And the work was true. 48 times the men built the frame, turned the arch, set the keystone, and struck the centering, and 48 times the stone stood. Then they moved the timbers along and began again. And slowly, from both banks at once, the two halves of the great bridge crept toward each other across the water. This is a thing worth marveling at on its own. Two companies, with two crews, starting from opposite shores, each turning arch after arch, had to meet in the middle of a wide river and have their work line up exactly, the same height, the same line, the same level deck, so the join between them would be seamless and true. There was no room to miss, and they did not miss. When the eastern arches of Drake and Stratton and the western arches of H.S. Kerbaugh came together over the Susquehanna, they met as one, and the longest stone bridge in the history of the world was closed from shore to shore. That is the true and whole picture of the Rockville Bridge, and it is worth holding steadily in mind, because it is finer and rarer than the simple story. It was neither a purely ancient thing nor a purely modern one. It was the exact meeting point of two ages of the world. The steam derrick lifted the stone the mason's chisel had shaped by hand. The poured concrete filled the hidden core the hand-laid stone would then face and carry. The engineer, with his transit and his drawings, stood beside the immigrant mason with his mallet and his practiced eye, and neither could have raised this bridge without the other. That is the deepest thing to carry away from Rockville. The machine and the hand were not enemies on this river. They were partners, and their partnership is written into every one of the 48 arches. And that partnership is the reason the thing could be done in 2 years. Take away the machines, and the lifting of 220,000 tons of stone would have dragged the work out for a decade or longer, the way the raising of a single cathedral once consumed whole generations. But take away the masons, and there would have been no true arch at all, no structure that could stand in honest compression and endure for centuries. Put the two together, the steam power for the brute weight, and the trained hand for the fine and knowing work. Set 800 men to it on both banks at once, and the greatest stone bridge in all of history could rise from an empty riverbed to a finished span in about 2 years. It looks now like a near miracle of organization. It was no miracle. It was both ages of the world pulling hard on the same rope. When it was finished in March of 1902, what stood over the Susquehanna was something the eye could scarcely take in all at once. Imagine standing on the bank and looking down the length of it. 48 arches, every one the twin of the last, 70 feet of clear open span between each pair of piers, marching away and shrinking with distance, until the far end near Marysville seemed almost to touch the horizon. The better part of a mile of cut stone, and through every arch the daylight and the moving river showing clean, and the whole enormous work doubled again in the calm water below. It did not look like a machine, and it did not look like industry. It looked like something that had grown up out of the riverbed, or had always stood there, more like a range of low hills than anything men had made. And it went straight to work, for it was never a monument built for show. It was the busiest kind of working structure, and from the day it opened, it carried the full weight of the standard railroad of the world, across the river on 4 broad tracks. It swallowed whole the traffic that had choked the old iron bridge, and then asked for more. Here at last was the crossing that Cassatt's 4-track main line had needed all along, the wide and permanent gateway through which the whole east and west traffic of the greatest railroad on earth could pour across the Susquehanna without checking its speed or waiting its turn. The bottleneck of 2 generations was broken, and it was broken in stone. Think for a moment of everything that crossed it. Coal came across those arches out of the Pennsylvania fields by the endless trainload. The black fuel that fired the furnaces and forged the steel and warmed the homes of the eastern half of the country. Freight of every imaginable kind crossed it. The raw materials of a continent running one way, and the finished goods of its factories running the other. And the passengers crossed it, the great named express trains and the humble locals alike. Whole generations of travelers riding over the wide Susquehanna, and not one in 1,000 ever knowing or wondering what work of stone carried them so smoothly over the water. Then came the hardest test any bridge can face, which is not one great storm on one terrible night, but the long, grinding weight of history itself, pressing down year upon year. The Rockville Bridge carried the traffic of the First World War, when the railroads of the nation were strained near to breaking, hauling the men and munitions and material of war to the crowded eastern ports. It carried the lean years of the Great Depression that followed, and then it carried the far heavier burden of the Second World War, when again everything a great country could produce rolled toward the coast, and the main line ran day and night at the outer limit of what stone and steel could bear. Through all of it, the bridge simply held. It did not falter and did not complain. The trains crossed, the river ran on beneath them, and the arches stood, and all the while, across those decades, the trains kept growing heavier. This is the thing about a stone arch that a working engineer learns to marvel at over a lifetime in the trade. The locomotives and loaded cars of 1902 were heavy enough in their day, but the ones of the decades that came after were far heavier still, some many times the weight the first builders ever had in mind. An iron truss would have been stressed and fatigued and cracked and at last condemned by loads like those. But the stone arch only pressed harder down into its own compression, and the harder it pressed, the more solidly it stood. A well-built arch does not resent a heavy load. In its own strange way, it welcomes the weight. Every ton that rolls across is one more ton driving the stones together, wedging the whole structure tighter into the shape that holds it up. This is the quiet and complete vindication of the men who chose stone. Where a steel bridge must be endlessly repainted against the rust, and forever inspected against the hidden cracks of fatigue, and sooner or later closed and torn apart and rebuilt at enormous cost, the great arch at Rockville has asked for almost nothing across the whole span of its life. It does not rust, because there is no iron in its skin to rust. It does not fatigue, because stone in honest compression does not tire. It has needed watching, as any bridge must be watched, and a little tending here and there down the years. But it has never once needed the single thing that finishes off every steel bridge in the end, which is wholesale replacement. The Pennsylvania Railroad that built it is gone now. It grew old, it merged with a great rival, and at the last, it faded and passed quietly into history, the way even the mightiest companies do in the fullness of time. Its successors took over the main line, and then their successors after them, and the pattern of the traffic shifted along with the changing country around it. The great 4-track main line was cut back over the years, as the trains changed and the tonnage moved in new ways, and the bridge today does not carry the 4 full tracks that once thundered across it in its prime, but it carries trains. That, in the end, is the whole point of it. The company that built the bridge to last forever did not itself last forever. The bridge has outlived its own maker, and it is quietly outliving the rest of us. For the Rockville Bridge is not a ruin, and it is not a museum piece behind a velvet rope. It is a working railroad bridge today, this very day, carrying the trains of a working railroad across a great river, exactly as it was meant to do. The long, heavy freight trains of the Norfolk Southern Railway crossed the wide Susquehanna on those same 48 stone arches, the freight of the 21st century rolling over masonry that was cut and set by hand before the First World War was ever fought. And the passenger trains cross it as well. Amtrak's Pennsylvanian, running its long route across the breadth of the state, carries its travelers over the river on the very same arches, so that a man riding that train today crosses the Susquehanna on a bridge more than 120 years old, and, in all likelihood, never gives it a passing thought. Think of what that means as a plain matter of money, since the hard-headed men who built it certainly did. They spent about $1 million to build their crossing in stone, a great fortune in the money of that day, and far more than a bridge of common iron would have cost. And for that one-time cost, paid once and never again, they bought a river crossing that has carried the heaviest traffic on Earth for more than 120 years without ever demanding to be rebuilt, while the steel bridges of its own generation have nearly all been condemned and torn down and replaced, some of them more than once over. The extra price of stone, paid a single time at the turn of the century, has been repaid 100-fold in every decade the bridge has stood and worked, and asked for nothing. It is recognized now, and rightly, as a historic civil engineering landmark, honored at last as a monument to the men and methods and materials that raised it. But it wears that honor lightly, because it has never stopped working long enough to settle into being a mere relic. Most of the great structures we call landmarks were long ago retired from their labor and preserved as memory alone. This one is honored and still on the job, both at the same time, which is a rare and stubborn and wonderful thing to be. The bronze plaque and the fine words mean little to the bridge itself. It goes on doing, here in the 21st century, the same work it was built to do in the 20th, which is to carry the trains across the water without the slightest fuss. And here is the best of it, the thing that sets this old bridge apart from so many other vanished wonders of that great age of building. You can still go and see it for yourself, and see it doing its work. Drive up along the Susquehanna, a few miles north of Harrisburg. Find a place to stand on the riverbank, and look out at 3,820 feet of stone arches reaching away across the wide water toward Marysville, exactly as the engineer George Nauman once looked out at the empty river before a single stone of it existed. It is all still there in front of you. Not a model of it, not a photograph of it, but the thing itself, the very stones those Italian masons cut and dressed and set, standing to this day right where they set them. Wait a little while there on that quiet bank, and a train will come. You will hear it first, well before you see it, a low sound gathering somewhere down the line, and slowly growing. And then the head of it will swing out onto the arches, and the long string of cars will follow it out over the river, rolling steadily across a bridge built in the first years of the 20th century, carrying the freight or the passengers of a whole new century its builders never lived to see. And the arches will not so much as tremble beneath it. They will do under a heavy modern train exactly what they did under the first train that ever crossed them in 1902, which is to stand, and to carry, and to say nothing at all about it. Stand there on the riverbank long enough, and the whole of the long story seems to gather quietly into that one plain sight. The richest railroad the world had yet seen, and Alexander Cassatt spending its fortune to build for a future he would not live to enter, and the engineer George Nauman alone on the bank with his drawings, and the two rival contractors racing their arches toward the middle of the river, and the steam derricks swinging the great blocks up through the smoke and the noise. And above all, the 300 immigrant masons with their mallets and chisels, cutting each stone to the curve of the arch and setting it dead true, and moving on to the next. 48 arches all the way across the Susquehanna. They built it to last forever, and every train that still crosses it today says plainly that they may yet be proven right. So go and stand on that riverbank while you can. Watch a train roll across the oldest new thing in Pennsylvania, remember the men who made it, and subscribe to Global Old History.